off season, but I can't complain because it's not as long as the last one. But I still am getting itchy feet. Dan Power with you with itchy feet, joined as always by the Professor Pete Steinberg. And Pete, how are your feet? Itchy as well?
My feet are a little itchy, although I have to say that I watched more rugby last weekend than I have since the end of the MLR season, because there were a bunch of men's internationals going on, a bunch of women's internationals, and got my 20-month-old son to get excited to watch Bugby. He would point at the he would point at the TV and he'd say, Bugby. I'm like, okay, cool, that works. So I watched a ton. It felt like, it's not quite like an MLR, like, Super Saturday, Super Sunday that we have every weekend, where you've got to actually watch the game and pay attention because you've got, like, you might call the game next weekend, or we've got this podcast. But it was a lot of rugby. The Ireland New Zealand men's game was great. There was the France New Zealand women's game was also a really interesting game. So lots of rugby to watch. So the two things that I really look for is when the bye is and home and away. There's a little bit of sort of, let's have a look and see if there's any key matchups in the conference that you think might be important. But to me as a coach, when I look at this, I'm like, home games, right? So if we're on the road a lot early, people don't realize on the road means you're losing probably a couple of training sessions, right? Because you got to travel, and you got to recover, you got to travel. So early on in the season, playing a lot away is challenging. Being at home a lot in the season is great. You get more time to be with the team. So those are kind of things that we can look at. But let's, I have a little Professor breakdown on thanks to Stats Boy breaking it down for me. I have a little tidbit for every team, so every fan can have something to grab hold of.
I'll do what infuriates you the most. I'll go to the very end. There's also a change in the playoff structure. We're going actually to what it was planned to be for this year, but
that's right.
COVID changed it, so now we will have an extra week off playoffs. So we'll have an elimination final first, where the second and third seeds will play each other. So the first seed, East and West, will get a week off, and then they'll play the winner of that game. Winner obviously then goes to the championship.
And Dan, again, when you look at buys, there are some teams that if they make the playoffs, but they're not the number one seed, they might be playing 10 or 11 games on the trot without a bye to get to the final. Mm-hmm. So you got to think, like, early buys help for you to be good early on in the season. But if you've got a long run at the end of the season, it's going to be tough when you get into those playoffs. Well, I mean, I'm looking at, because as I said, I think there are two teams that we think in the East, or we know in the East, are going to be good because they have traditionally been good, and that's ATL and NOLA. And it's also the rivalry, right? And so you look at ATL, and they play Old Glory at home, then they play NOLA away and New York at home. So we're going to know very early on how they stack up. Then they have a bye, which is pretty good early on, and then they've got a couple of home games. They've only got one away game in the first 6 weeks. That's good if you've got a lot of turnover. You may not have that in ATL, but I like that. But I went back and you look, their last game of the season is at home against NOLA Gold. And I kind of feel like that game is going to have something like hanging on it, right? These are two teams, whether it's seeding, like that could be the game that decides who gets the bye the following week. Like that's going to be a really, really, and it's a grudge match, right? Like it's the NOLA ATL rivalry, and having that, like that's great scheduling by Nish and his team to have NOLA Gold ATL. Yeah,
Old Glory DC looking for a rebound year.
So, Old Glory DC, the interesting thing for me, home games in February. So they've got New England at home on February 18th and Toronto at home on February 26th. Like it can be nice in DC, but it could also be bitter cold. But they're playing two teams at home that are used to that can play in it, right? And we'll talk about this a little bit in a couple other schedules. So having those two home games early, I think is going to be interesting for them. They start off with ATL. That's a tough game. They've got a really tough first 5 games going into their bye. So we'll know a lot, like ATL, Gilgronis, New York, Toronto, and San Diego. Like we know out of those, we know that last year they were all fighting for playoff contention except for Toronto. And Toronto was on the longest road trip known to man. So we think Toronto are going to be better. By the time they get to their bye on week 6, we'll have a good idea about where Old Glory are.
Yeah. And it's, again, interested to see that roster. Jason Robinson, obviously, over in France.
That's right, yeah.
Real good 10. What happens with Robbo and who comes in, who goes out. We'll get into that in the team preview. So, all right, moving right along. You've already mentioned a few times the Free Jacks from Boston, Massachusetts.
So, New England, a couple of things that are interesting. First of all, a bye the second week.
Oh,
right?
ouch.
Yeah, ouch, right? Probably to do with just weather, right? You just can't play. New England have their first home game in week 6, the middle of March. Still going to potentially be cold. So, that's like having, and then they're away, right? So they're away at NOLA. They have their bye. They're away at Old Glory. They're away at the Giltinis. That's a long trip. They're away at New York. So they've got a lot of road games. So early on, hard for the coaches to really be able to do new stuff. Their preseason has to be very, very good. And then they're again one of these teams, because they have early buys, right? They're one of these teams. They've got a long run after their first bye, and then they've got 6 or 7 games at the end of the season. So they're gonna, if they could potentially be playing the final as their 10th game on a row. And I think most teams don't. I don't think there's any team in season that has 10 games in a row that's scheduled. Like, we're trying to break that up. So both of those things stood out for me with the Free Jacks.
All right, let's jump onto the Western Conference now, and we'll start things off in Austin with the A's, Austin Gilgronis, doing some good things down there. They had a good year. I'll tick their box for a successful year from where they came from. What do they have ahead of them for 2022?
Well, I really like their buys. So they have a buy in week 8. They have a buy in week 15, which means if they're in that playoff hunt, it breaks it up pretty well. And their first 3 games are at home. They're at home to Dallas, Old Glory, and Utah. So again, an opportunity to really work with their players early on and recover. And I think that you would say, based on last year's performance, Dallas and Old Glory are 2 things that Austin are going to go in with some confidence. And then they'll be tested by that Utah team, and that'll be a good test for them. So I like the way that the season starts for the Gilgronis.
All right. Dallas, new kids on the block. There you go. They've got pop culture. I had to work in some pop culture somewhere. What do you think? What do you think for the Jackals?
Well, I have looked at, they have 2 away games. They play Austin away and San Diego away. And I've marked week 3 against the Houston SabreCats as a bit of a marker for them, right? I think Austin and San Diego come in as probably people that think, that they're going to be in the playoffs. Austin started strong, couldn't quite hold on. San Diego started weakly, but then had a good run. But the Houston SabreCats, that would be a good marker for Dallas. And they're, they don't have a great, for them, they don't have a great buy. They've got a buy at week 8 and a buy at week 17. It would take something pretty special for Dallas to be in the playoff hunt. Not impossible, right? But it's like building a team from scratch takes more than just getting good players, right? There's a lot of culture building. The Giltinis did it last year, right? Yeah. So it's not impossible, but I think that's tough. But I think that week 3 against the Houston SabreCats is a good marker for both teams.
Did you say the Houston SabreCats or the Houston South Africats? Because Heineke Meyer is putting together quite the roster down there. And they're up next. What do you think of their schedule?
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. So they get tested early, right? They have 2 home games. They get to play the LA Giltinis right off the bat at home. So that's going to be a good test of the additional players they're bringing in. And then they play Rugby New York at home. And I think those are 2 good tests at Aviva, right? Where we're going to find out like how good these new players are and how good the new coaching staff is. So I think there's a good test for them early. They've got good buys. Their buys are on week 7 and week 13. So that works well. And they have a home game against the Austin Gilgronis at the end of the season. So that might be an interesting game for them as they, in that Texas rivalry, if there's something on that game.